Well, I hope that everybody had a good Christmas. I know this Christmas is different than probably any Christmas you've ever had before. And I know for a lot of people, with everything going on in the world right now, this Christmas was difficult. It was hard. But I hope that through everything that's happened this year, that this Christmas is one that stands out in your memory as one where you were able to draw close to Jesus and recognize Jesus for who he is and experience him in a new way. That's my hope and prayer for everything that's happened this year. Now, I realize that it's been a little while since I've had the opportunity to preach to you, Rosewood, and I think the last time was actually in October. Now, I guess that's not that long ago, but the reason for that isn't just because Dan doesn't like my preaching, or at least I hope not. The reason for that is actually has to do with some of the difficulties that have been going on with my dad. As many of you know, a few years back, my dad was diagnosed with esophageal cancer, and he has gone through chemo, he's gone through radiation, he's gone through, I think, 7 surgeries up until this point, with 5 of those surgeries being all within a couple weeks of each other back in September of this year. So it's been quite the ride he's been on out of anybody, but also for our family, it's been interesting. And actually, over these past few months, I've been slated to preach 2 other times, but both times had to rush off, one to Toronto, one to, it was a week I spent kind of at the hospital with my dad here in Regina, where we thought it was the end, where we didn't think that he was going to be making it much further. And in fact, I think over this process, over this 2.5 years, I probably said goodbye to my dad for what I thought was the final time. About 5 or 6 times. So it's been an interesting last couple of years, and to say the least, it's been difficult. It's been hard. And put on top of that, everything that's been going on with COVID in the world right now, everything that our church has been through in the last couple of years. And honestly, it's been a hard couple of years for myself, for my family. But you know what? We're doing okay. And I thank you for all of your prayers, and I thank you for how you, church, have been standing behind us and our family during this time. Now, I don't tell you any of this because I want you to feel sorry for me, or because I want you to, get emotional or anything like that. I don't want you to have pity for me. I appreciate the prayers, of course, but that's not why I tell you any of this. The reason I tell you this is because even though it's the holiday season, even though it's Christmas time right now, even though it's a time where we're not usually focused on difficult and hard things, I recognize that there's this fact that we are facing some hard things in life right now. And many people may be facing some really tough hardships, that not even on top of what's going on with COVID and what's going on around the world, in a time where, we are facing a lot of unknowns, where people are scared. People are really coming face to face with the reality of life and the hardships of life and the suffering of life. And we've all had to learn to live within new structures and new ways of doing things this past year that none of us have ever been through before. And today, what I want to talk to you about is what it means to be a follower of Jesus in times of uncertainty. Now, I am far from perfect in this. Far from perfect in this. But I believe the last 2.5 years, 3 years have given me some good experiences, at least, to help kind of speak to what it means to walk through some of these unknowns, what it means to walk through some of these adversities. And I know for me, there have been some tough things, but I also realize that what I see as tough and what I see as difficult is not even close to some of the things that some of you have been through and what others have to deal with. My adversity, my unknowns, my experiences, they come from my perspectives and how I see what's happening with people I love, how I see and feel with things that are happening in the world. But my hope is that today that God can speak to you through some of the experiences, some of the perspectives that I have, but mostly through his word and what he has to say about walking through difficult times. Now, today we're going to be looking at the book of Habakkuk. This is a book that gets forgotten about in most people's Bibles, honestly. It's been a while since I've read the book of Habakkuk. I even had a hard time flipping through my Bible to the right page to find it. It's in the Minor Prophets, and And it's a very quick book. It's a 3-chapter book. And what I want us to do is, we're not going to read through every part of the book of Habakkuk today, but we're going to be doing, kind of gaining some understanding of what he was going through and how God spoke into his situation. Now, to understand the situation, let me give you a little bit of context of what was going on. So the book of Habakkuk is what's called a lament to God. And it's a lament because really it starts off with Habakkuk bringing complaints to God, bringing some issues to God that he's really passionate about and that he is feeling. And it's a lament to God because of that. And it's written by the prophet Habakkuk to God around the year 605 BC. They don't know exactly when it was written, but it's right before the Babylonian Empire swept in through Jerusalem and sent off its inhabitants to Babylon. Now, if you've heard of Daniel in the lion's den, you know Daniel was one of those inhabitants that got shipped off to Babylon. And so Habakkuk would have been around when Daniel was around, likely. Now, this book, again, like I said, it's considered a lament because the majority of this book is a conversation between Habakkuk and God about some of the issues that Habakkuk is seeing and that he's bringing towards God and that he's passionate towards God about. And it starts off with these 2 complaints, like I mentioned before. The first complaint has to do with the nation of Israel. Habakkuk is just kind of fed up with the evil that's going on in Israel right now, the injustices that he sees, the difficulties that he sees going on, you know, the idolatry that is happening, and how people have turned away from God. And God answers that first complaint right away. And he answers that complaint by saying he is going to deal with the evil and the injustice and the idolatry of Israel by actually bringing the Babylonian Empire into Jerusalem to kind of wipe them out. Now, Habakkuk's second complaint has to do with that answer, okay? Because Habakkuk is like, whoa, God, like, hold on a second. Are you telling me that you're going to bring a nation in that is far more evil than us, that is far more evil than Israel, that is known for doing some pretty evil and ungodly things, and you're going to bring this nation in to teach us a lesson? Like, that doesn't seem right. And so Habakkuk is bringing that to God, being like, what is your plan here? What are you trying to do? And you can imagine that being a difficult thing for Habakkuk to understand. He attempts to understand why God would do this, why God would allow this. And if you were to go through the rest of the book of Habakkuk, you hear from God and God's answer and how he explains that sometimes he needs to use corrupt nations to do his bidding in order to move his plans forward. Because here's the thing, God sees things from a much bigger perspective than we do. We often see a very limited portion of things. We're going to talk about more of that at the end of this message. But we need to understand that right from the beginning, that God's perspectives on things is different. God has a plan. God has a purpose that he is moving forward. And sometimes he uses bad people to move that plan forward in some way. And the book of Habakkuk really is about asking God questions. And it gives us a great example to follow when we, as God's creations, have these big questions. And each of us has questions. Each of us has difficulties, things that we're experiencing or that we're not experiencing, asking God why he's maybe not acting in a certain way for us in a given situation. And that's the place that I've been at the last number of months, as I've kept asking God, okay, God, what is your plan for my dad? That's where I've been stuck, this place that I've been kind of going back and forth with God on. And there are bigger questions, kind of more global questions than that. And one of those has to do with, COVID. Why is COVID going on in the world right now? Because, we don't know what's happening with it. The world has never been more divided. There are crazy things happening because of this pandemic. And we come to God asking him, God, what are you doing? What's the purpose of this? Like, where are you taking us? And these are big questions to ask God. All these things are huge, huge questions to ask God. And I believe that this book in Habakkuk helps provide some answers for that. Not because, God actually does provide answers to Habakkuk very clearly, but rather the book of Habakkuk helps us to know how we can respond and how we can walk more fully with God, knowing how to respond in a certain way to what God is doing in the world. And let's be honest, we've been through some tough times. We've been through some difficult times. And I guarantee a lot of us are kind of questioning God and saying, God, how do we walk through these uncertain times right now? And you know what? God does have an answer for us. And I think there's some answers here in the book of Habakkuk. Now, the first part of Habakkuk that I want to look at today is Habakkuk 2, verse 1. And this is right after Habakkuk's second complaint to God about the fact that God is going to use this evil nation, this Babylonian, or what the Chaldeans as they call them, to come and purge Israel. So this is in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1. And again, so Habakkuk has just heard God's answer that he's going to bring the Babylonians in. And then he complains to God. And at the very end of his complaint about the Babylonians coming in, he says this to God. He says, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. Okay, so what's going on here is to finish off his complaint, Habakkuk is telling God that I want to hear from you. I'm going to go to a place, whether figuratively or literally, I'm going to this place, this watchtower, this watch post, to wait on you, God. To a place I know where I can see you, where I expect to hear from you. Because I need answers from you, God. Now, one commentator talks about the idea that this reveals Habakkuk's wisdom in the fact that he needs an answer to his question, and he will only accept that answer from God himself. And guess what? God answers him. And for the rest, almost the rest of the book of Habakkuk, we see God's answer to him about what God's plans are for the Babylonian people. And the way God starts off this answer is he says in verse 2, the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. So God is telling him that, Habakkuk, get ready, because I'm about to reveal to you what is going to happen to the Babylonian people. But I'm not only going to just reveal that to you, Habakkuk. I'm going to reveal a lot more about, not just what I'm going to do to the Babylonians, but, who I am as God. And that's what the majority of the rest of the book of Habakkuk is about. And, if you look through chapter 2 more, you see these woes listed about what's going to happen to the Babylonian Empire. And you know that it means that affliction, distress, and trouble is going to come on them soon enough. Now, when I put myself in Habakkuk's shoes, I realize there's probably not many of us that are questioning God on dealing with a wicked nation that's about to take us over. I mean, it depends how into politics you are, maybe, but I don't think there's many of us praying to God in that way. But we do have these kind of questions for God where we desire an answer, where we want to know what God is going to do about a certain situation. The funny thing is, we more often than not do the opposite of what Habakkuk does. We don't wait on God. We usually jump at the fact that we have the answers, that we know best, and we jump in there and we try to answer the problem on our own. We may even pray to God, God help me, but without waiting and listening to God, we just take off and go and do our own thing. But waiting on God can't just be something that we do when we reach the end of our rope. It needs to be the first thing that we do. And it's funny how sometimes the first thing we need to do is sometimes the hardest. I know for a fact that waiting on God sometimes is the most difficult thing to do. When I am in a stressful situation, or I'm in a difficult situation where I'm experiencing suffering, pain, difficulty, waiting is not the thing that I do most easily during that time. And, God is saying here to Habakkuk, here it comes. You're waiting on me, I will give you an answer. But in his time, not Habakkuk's time. Psalm 27 is a great psalm that, after reading it, I have to imagine that Habakkuk somehow knew about this psalm when he wrote his book, because it is so relevant to what Habakkuk is going through. And I would encourage you to read through the whole psalm to get a really good understanding of what we need to do when we are going through uncertain times. But in Psalm 27, verse 14, this is what David says. He says, wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Like I said, often the most difficult thing to do in tough times and in difficult times is the best thing that we can do. We need to wait on God. We need to be strong. We need to have courage. But most of all, we need to wait on Him and trust in His perspective. Because like I said before, His perspective is much higher than ours. And He sees much more of the picture than we do. So when we are walking through uncertain times, we need to wait on God. Now, the next thing that we have to do when we're walking through uncertain times is that we need to be willing to walk by faith. Now, if we continue working our way through chapter 2, we get to verse 4. And here's what verse 4 of chapter 2 in Habakkuk says. It says, "Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by faith." Okay, so that first part of that verse, God is referring to Babylon there. And He's referring to the fact that, their soul is not upright. They are puffed up. They are proud. Then God uses that word but. But the righteous shall live by faith. Now, when God says the righteous shall live by faith, this is one of the most important verses in the book of Habakkuk. And the reason why this is one of the most important verses is because it actually answers both of Habakkuk's complaints. Okay, so the first complaint that Habakkuk had was about Israel, Judah, and Jerusalem going so far away from God that Habakkuk wanted God to do something about it. And 2 verse 4 is God's answer to it. The righteous need to walk by faith, meaning that the children of Israel are called and directed to walk in righteousness and in faith in God. This is their responsibility. This is what God has been telling them to do from the beginning. And up until this point, though, they've not been doing a very good job of it. But God is reiterating it again here, that the responsibility of the righteous is to walk by faith. They need to trust in God, not in all these other idols and these other things that they're trying to trust in. You see, they are unrighteous because they haven't been walking by faith. They haven't been following the law of God. They've been turning away from Him constantly, over and over and over again. So much so that God now is intervening with the Babylonians coming in. Now, God also saying the righteous shall live by faith answers the other complaint of Habakkuk. Because Habakkuk's other complaint, again, was about God deciding to send the Babylonians. And what God is telling Habakkuk here is that when this happens, the righteous need to live by faith. Habakkuk recognizes that things are about to get very, very hard and very, very difficult for himself and for the rest of the Israelites. The Babylonians coming in is not going to be a pleasant thing. And you know what? God knows this too. So He is calling Habakkuk and his readers to walk in righteousness and walk by faith. Faith in the fact that God is sovereign. Faith in the fact that God has a plan. Not just for the Babylonians, but for Israel. And yes, they are about to go through a difficult, hard time. A time of suffering, a time of unknowns, a time where they don't know what is going to happen. But God is calling the righteous to walk by faith. Now, this verse 4 here, or that second half of verse 4, is actually out of all the rest of the book of Habakkuk, this verse is quoted the most in the New Testament, which is interesting. Paul quotes it a number of times. In Romans 1:17, Paul quotes it when he's referring to the fact that is through the gospel that Jesus is revealed and righteousness is revealed, and righteousness that comes by faith is revealed. In Galatians 3:11-12, Paul quotes Habakkuk 2:4 again, when referring to the fact that following the Mosaic law cannot give righteousness. It actually points out how unrighteous we truly are. Rather, by faith in Christ alone can we be considered righteous. And then in Hebrews 10:37-38, the author quotes this verse in Habakkuk as a means to encourage the believers to continue walking in their faith and not be shrinking back when things get difficult. The reason this verse is quoted as many times as it is in the New Testament is because it sums up a huge aspect of how the believer needs to live their lives. we should be so thankful that we are saved by grace through faith. Like it says in the book of Ephesians, that because of Jesus Christ, we are saved by having faith in him. We are made righteous before God because of what Jesus did on the cross and by being resurrected. We are called to live out our lives by that faith in Jesus, day in and day out. And we are called to live out that faith, like Habakkuk says, to live, the righteous shall live by faith. We are called to live that out every single day, no matter what struggle, no matter what difficulty we are going through. Now, being told to walk by faith is something that is often quoted by well-meaning Christians and well-meaning believers. And it's one of those Bible verses that often, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, it's definitely happened to me, where we're sharing a struggle with someone or a difficulty, and someone will really nicely say, well, you just need to walk by faith. You just need to live by faith. So sometimes this verse can totally feel like a slap in the face. And often it feels like a slap in the face from people that, they don't really want to get involved in your situation. They don't really want to get involved in your struggle, but they're kind of looking to use a Bible verse to get out of it so that they don't have to, be there to help or be there to sympathize with you. And I think we need to stop doing that. If you've ever done that, Christians, let's stop. Our job is to love and care for people. Let's not throw Bible verses at them just to get out of conversations, especially a Bible verse like this. Even though it is true we need to walk by faith, 100% true, let's not use it as a means to not care for people and walk alongside them. So for Habakkuk, though, things are very different. Okay, so it's not just some random person coming up to him and saying, hey, you know what? You just have to live by faith. That's all you have to do. It's not that happening. Habakkuk does need to walk by faith. The people that are reading Habakkuk need to walk by faith. But it's not a person telling them this. It's God telling them this. It is the creator of all things telling them this. The Holy of Holies, the Alpha and the Omega, the one who knows all, sees all, and reigns over all. That's who's telling them to walk by faith. Not just a stranger. Not just, some well-meaning person. It is God. And because God is the one who is sovereign, we can trust in what he says. So, God is in control of all things. God cares deeply about the big things and the little things going on in our lives. He is all-powerful. He is all-knowing. He is all-present. And when he is the one that says to walk or live by faith, that has a lot of meaning behind it. That's because he is truly the only one that is sovereign. God truly holds all things in his hand and truly does have supreme authority and rule over all things, which is what the word sovereign means. So perhaps we need to hear from God when we're in the middle of whatever struggles that we're dealing with. Perhaps we need to hear from him when we're dealing with some difficult things. And you know what? By him being the one that tells us to walk by faith, it doesn't mean that walk is going to be easy. It doesn't mean that we're not going to have any issues. It doesn't mean it's going to be a walk in the park. But it does mean that it will be a walk with him. And if we are walking with him, trust me, we can walk through any issue. We can walk through the valley of the shadow of death itself and fear no evil. So when we're going through times of uncertainty, that second point is that we need to walk by faith. Now, the final thing that Habakkuk shows us about walking through uncertainty is that we need to recognize who God is. If we move through the book of Habakkuk, what we realize quickly is that chapter 3 is all about Habakkuk recognizing who God truly is. And this is our, next important step. We see line after line in chapter 3 explaining different aspects of who God is. Aspects of his character, aspects of his actions, aspects of his wrath, aspects of his mercy, of his love, and his salvation. And in light of all of that, I want you to listen to Habakkuk's response in chapter 3, verse 16. Here's what he says. It says, I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Okay, that's Habakkuk's response. You know, what Habakkuk is saying here is that he is suddenly reminded of who God is. He is comparing himself and putting himself in the right place. He is humbling himself before God, recognizing that God is mighty, that God is all powerful. And if you read the rest of chapter 3, you'll see that. Habakkuk's breath is taken away. He trembles and he quivers at the realization of exactly who God is. And he decides that he will quietly wait on God to do what God needs to do. You know what? Habakkuk's progression in this book is amazing to me. First, he comes to God with these complaints. And guess what? You know, that's okay to God, it seems. God hears him. But then we get to the end and the posture changes. He is humbled before God when he recognizes who God is. And this is something we all need to understand. We need to ask ourselves a question. How do we approach God? Do we approach him just completely casual, like we're in charge, piling our needs on him, bringing him our issues, and then just getting him to take care of them and walking away? If we do, then our approach to God needs to change. The wonderful thing is that because of Jesus' death and resurrection, God is approachable. But he is still God. He deserves our respect above anyone else. He is the Almighty. He is someone that we should not approach lightly. When we recognize who we are and who God is, our perspective changes. And we start to again remember that he is the one that holds all things in his hands. He is the one who is sovereign. He is the one who knows. And you can see that perspective change for Habakkuk again in his final words in chapter 3, verse 17 to 19. Here's what he says. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor the fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. What Habakkuk is saying here is even if there's no source of food, even if he has no access to sustenance in the coming years, he will yet rejoice in the God of his salvation. He will trust in his God for strength. He will trust in his God to make his feet like the deer's, to lighten his load. He will trust in God to lift him up. That is a great truth to read and a great truth to hold on to in uncertain times. And it's all about recognizing who God is. No matter what we face, and trust me, we will face insurmountable issues, or at least seemingly insurmountable issues. No matter how hard, no matter how painful, how strenuous, how difficult the situation is, we need to recognize who God is. And we need to rejoice in who he is, even when that's hard. Even when we're in a place where we're uncomfortable. Even when we're in a situation we don't like or that we would want to change. We need to rejoice in who God is. We need to recognize that he is the God of our salvation. He is the saving one. He will make our feet like the deer. He will make us tread on high places once again, because that is who God says he is. That is who Habakkuk reveals God to be. And we know all of this because he provided Jesus. He didn't leave the Israelite people hanging. He brought a remnant back from Babylon. He helped them reestablish themselves, though never to the same glory they had been before. And while the relationship with God seemingly had changed, the thing is that God is preparing something great, not just for the Israelite people, but for the entire world. He was preparing to bring his son, Jesus, into the world. So the answer to our hard questions, it's Jesus. So hear me out here for a second. I want you to think back to some of those hard questions I talked about earlier. Maybe in regards to COVID and why we're going through this. You know what? I think the answer we can say is Jesus. And how do I get to that point? Because we have an opportunity to be Jesus to a very different world right now. And in a very different way than we have been in the past. We have a world around us that is literally losing their minds over all of this. A world who is scared. A world that is more divided than it has been in a long, long time. And who is the answer to all of those questions? It's Jesus. Jesus is the one we need to turn to with our anxieties and our fears, because Jesus is the one that brings peace. Jesus is the one we turn to when we are sick and hurting, because Jesus heals. Jesus is the one we need to turn to when we are divided and going after one another, because Jesus unites and brings unity. That is who Jesus is, and that is the answer to those questions. We need Jesus desperately. And what about the other questions I asked? The other issues? Jesus is the answer to those as well. You know, I told you before that my big questions for God right now have to do with where my dad is at. How I can't understand why he is going through this roller coaster of ups and downs and difficulties with his health. I've been questioning why God doesn't either heal him or just take him home. Because I don't like seeing my dad suffer. My dad doesn't like suffering. It's difficult to watch someone go through that. No doubt, way more difficult to go through it. But you know what? My dad told me a story a week or two ago about something that happened in the hospital. And the fact that a man was placed in my dad's room and my dad was able to get to know, my dad was able to pray for, that my dad was able to help lead to Jesus. And upon hearing that story, all of a sudden I stopped seeing things from my perspective and started seeing them from God's. You see, the answer to my questions was Jesus. God had a plan for my dad to stick around in order to be in that room in that moment to meet this guy, because that man and that individual was worth it to Jesus. That person coming into a relationship with Jesus was worth all the suffering and all the difficulties my dad had to go through in order to be there in that moment, to be able to pray for him and bring him into relationship with Jesus. It was worth it for one more person to be able to enter into the kingdom of God. In the parable of the sheep that Jesus tells, the shepherd leaves the 99 sheep to chase after the one. Do you think that was comfortable for the other 99 sheep? Of course not. Their shepherd left them all alone. But it was worth it to the shepherd. And it was worth it to that one sheep that was lost. That one sheep that shepherd desperately wanted to have back with him. It was worth it. So the answer to your questions is Jesus. And perhaps God has been working out all kinds of things in your life right now so that you can finally realize your need for him. Maybe it's time for you to say yes to Jesus now, today, and begin that relationship with him. And I hope if that's you, that you will consider doing that today. But perhaps, God has been trying to show you how to live more like Jesus in the circumstances that you've been placed in right now. Because trust me, if you are in difficult circumstances in this moment, I can guarantee you that there are also others in those circumstances that don't yet know who Jesus is. I want you to know that God is not afraid of putting his followers in circumstances, in struggles that make them uncomfortable, that make them uneasy. Not just so that we can depend on him more, but also so we can reach out to those that are still lost. If you are suffering right now in any way, I want you to look around. Look for someone that is also in pain. Look for someone that is also struggling. Look for someone that is in that pain and that struggle without Jesus. And reach out to them. Because that is our calling as believers. It's all about perspective. And the book of Habakkuk is all about that perspective and helps us understand the difference between human perspective and God's perspective. At the beginning of the book, Habakkuk could only see things from his perspective. But at the end of the book, all of a sudden, he's starting to see things from a heavenly perspective. What perspective do you have on the struggles that you're going through right now? What perspective do you have on the struggles the world is going through right now? Is it your perspective or God's perspective?